Welcome to Relax Story, a peaceful place where gentle stories help you leave behind the worries of the day and drift into a calm, restful sleep. Each soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, ease tension, and bring a sense of comfort and peace. If you enjoy listening, please like and subscribe, and feel free to share your thoughts or story suggestions in the comments. Now, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a night of deep and peaceful sleep. Before huskies pulled sleds across frozen landscapes, before tiny chihuahuas could fit comfortably in the palm of a human hand, before German shepherds became symbols of loyalty or border collies gained fame for their remarkable intelligence, the world existed in a completely different state. It was an age when none of the dog breeds familiar to us today walked the earth. Between roughly 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, the planet was still passing through the final chapters of the Ice Age. Massive ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. Vast regions lay buried beneath ice kilometers thick. Sea levels stood dozens of meters lower than they do today, exposing lands that now rest far beneath the oceans. One of those lost landscapes was the Bering Land Bridge, a broad stretch of land that once connected Siberia and North America, allowing animals to move freely between continents without ever crossing the sea. From Western Europe, across the cold plains of Siberia, and all the way to Alaska, stretched an enormous ecosystem that no longer exists today. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe. It was not the endless frozen wasteland many people imagine when they think of the Ice Age. Instead, it was a vast grassland where cold winds swept across low vegetation, supporting immense herds of large animals. Humans at the time were still a relatively small and vulnerable species struggling to survive. On those windswept plains, wild animals were the true rulers of the world. Woolly mammoths moved slowly across the horizon. Woolly rhinoceroses wandered through frozen landscapes. Reindeer followed one another on migrations that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Ancient bison and prehistoric horses spread across the grasslands with the changing seasons. Following those great herbivore herds were the predators of the Ice Age. Among the most successful were populations of ancient grey wolves. They lived in packs, traveled constantly, and moved in rhythm with the massive migrations around them. Their survival depended on observation, cooperation, and an extraordinary ability to adapt to a world that never stood still. Yet wolves were not the most powerful animals in that world. They competed with cave lions, formidable hunters with overwhelming strength. They fought cave hyenas over carcasses. In North America, giant short-faced bears could easily steal the hard-earned kill of an entire wolf pack. In many regions, populations of saber-toothed cats were equally fearsome rivals. Food was always scarce. Territory was always contested. Even access to the carcass of a dead mammoth could determine whether an entire pack lived or died. In such a harsh environment, wolves survived not through unmatched strength, but through their remarkable adaptability. That quality would become one of the most important keys to the story that followed. When humans first began investigating the origins of dogs, the answer seemed simple. Dogs evolved from wolves. That statement is true, but only partly true. Advances in genetics have revealed a far more complex picture. When ancient DNA was recovered from wolf remains found in Siberia, Europe, and North America, researchers discovered that modern dogs did not descend directly from any living wolf population. The wolves roaming Canada today are not the direct ancestors of dogs. Neither are the wolves of Northern Europe. Even modern Siberian wolves are not the final link in that chain. The most likely explanation is that the ancestors of dogs belonged to one or more ancient wolf populations that disappeared from the earth thousands of years ago. They no longer exist in the wild. The only traces they left behind survive deep within the genomes of the hundreds of dog breeds that live alongside humans today. Rather than closing the mystery, this discovery made it even larger. Where the first dog appeared remains an unanswered question. Some theories point towards Siberia. Others favor Central Asia or East Asia. It is also possible that wolf populations from several different regions gradually moved closer to humans and exchanged genetic material over time. What researchers agree on more strongly is the deep connection between modern dogs and ancient wolf populations from Eastern Eurasia and East Asia. Whether those ancestors once lived on the plains of Siberia, the grasslands of Central Asia, or in some forgotten landscape erased by time, every theory eventually arrives at the same point. Somewhere in the frozen world of the Ice Age, a few wolves began appearing near the fires of human camps. No one knows exactly when that night occurred. What we do know is that from that moment onward, the history of both species began to change direction in a way no one could have imagined. Between 25,000 and 15,000 years ago, the world was entering the final chapters of the Ice Age. Vast, cold grasslands stretched all the way to the horizon, where winter winds swept across the land with almost nothing to slow them down. Humans had not yet built villages, planted crops, or raised the first cities. They lived in small groups of only a few dozen people, constantly moving in the footsteps of reindeer, wild horses, bison, and other large animals. Each night, when darkness settled over those frozen seas of grass, a remarkable sight appeared. Across the seemingly endless landscape, small fires flickered in the distance. They were fragile and temporary, often disappearing after only a few days as a group continued its journey. Yet those fires created something nature had never produced on its own. They marked the presence of a human-made center of activity, a place where food, tools, smoke, voices, and the traces of life gathered together. Humans were not the only creatures paying attention to these camps. Beyond the circle of light, other eyes watched from the darkness. Ravens waited patiently from afar. Red foxes quietly searched the ground for scents. Scavenging birds circled overhead in the cold sky. Ancient grey wolves also began appearing around these camps. At first glance, there seemed to be no reason why the meeting between humans and wolves would lead to a shared future. To wolves, humans were dangerous creatures armed with sharp stone spears and terrifying fire, capable of killing any animal that ventured too close. To humans, wolves were direct competitors in the search for food. Both pursued the same herds. Both survived in the same unforgiving environments. Everything suggested that they should avoid one another rather than move closer together. Yet some of the most profound changes in history do not begin with trust or cooperation. Sometimes they begin with something far simpler. They begin with food. After a successful hunt, humans rarely used every part of an animal. Large bones, organs, scraps of meat, and portions that were difficult to transport were often left behind near temporary camps. In the harsh environment of the Ice Age, these remains represented an incredibly valuable resource. For scavengers, it was an entirely new ecological opportunity. Ravens appeared more often. Foxes became frequent visitors. Wolves gradually entered the same circle of opportunity. What made wolves different was that they were not merely scavengers. They were highly organized hunters, capable of coordinating as a pack and adjusting their strategies as conditions changed. That flexibility allowed certain wolf populations to take advantage of this new resource more effectively than other species. A quiet evolutionary paradox was beginning to emerge. The wolves best suited for surviving in the wild were not necessarily the wolves best suited for surviving near humans. The new selective pressure was no longer centered on speed or physical strength. It revolved around something much less visible. It revolved around fear. Within every wolf population, individuals differed from one another. Some were exceptionally cautious and avoided anything unfamiliar. Some were aggressive and reacted strongly to every threat. Others were more curious, less fearful, and slightly more willing to take risks. The wolves most afraid of humans stayed far away from the firelight and the scent of smoke. In doing so, they lost access to an easy source of food. Those willing to move just a little closer could gain a significant reward. During difficult times, that extra food could make the difference between survival and starvation. No one realized that a new evolutionary process had already begun. There were no breeders, no selective breeding programs, no deliberate human control. There was only a new environment that consistently favored individuals capable of tolerating the presence of humans. Over hundreds of generations, those behavioral traits slowly accumulated. Calmer wolves had a greater chance of surviving. They reproduced and passed similar tendencies onto their offspring. What is especially fascinating is that the first changes may not have appeared in their coats, body size, or skull shape. They may have begun with personality. Evolution is often imagined as something dramatic and easy to see. In reality, the entire trajectory of a species can sometimes change simply because a new environment rewards a new type of behavior. When circumstances change, biological futures change with them. Even so, an important question remains. If everything started with food, how could that possibly lead to a relationship lasting tens of thousands of years? Perhaps the answer lies in a moment no one ever recorded. Somewhere on an Ice Age grassland that vanished long ago, a wolf stood closer to a campfire than usual. It watched the humans sitting around the orange glow. It caught the scent of food drifting through the cold air. It hesitated, but it did not run. The next day, another wolf did the same, then another, and another. The distance between the two species began to shrink. At first, it was only a few cautious steps. But across the scale of history, those steps would become the path leading from a wild predator to humanity's closest companion. It is possible that the first humans never consciously chose wolves. It is equally possible that certain wolves chose to remain near humans longer than the rest of their kind. From that seemingly insignificant decision, an entirely new history began to take shape. At first, There were only scraps of food left beside the fire, only a few shorter steps taken in the darkness. Yet over time, the presence of each species began to benefit the other. A partnership that would last tens of thousands of years was quietly taking form, opening the next chapter in the shared evolutionary journey of humans and dogs. Between roughly 20,000 and 12,000 years ago, the frozen landscapes of the late Ice Age witnessed a quiet transformation, one that would ultimately have a deeper impact than any human migration or natural climate shift. For generations, wolf populations living near human camps continued to exist at the edge of the firelight. They appeared and vanished in the darkness, close enough to see the glow of the flames, yet far enough away to avoid conflict. At first, the relationship was so simple, it was almost unremarkable. Humans left scraps behind after a hunt. Wolves took advantage of what remained. Each side tolerated the other's presence because neither had a clear reason to drive the other away. Yet time is a remarkable force in evolution. Things that repeat themselves for hundreds, then thousands of years often create opportunities that no individual could have recognized at the beginning. As the presence of each species became familiar to the other, an important shift began to emerge. Humans and wolves were no longer merely sharing the same landscape. They were starting to influence one another's chances of survival. The first benefits appeared on the human side, not because of the wolf's strength, not because of its ability to fight. The greatest advantage came from something humans had never possessed: its senses. In the world of the late Ice Age, survival depended on detecting changes in the environment before rivals could. A faint sound in the darkness might signal the approach of a predator. A scent carried on the wind could reveal a migrating herd of reindeer. A movement on the distant horizon might determine the success or failure of an entire hunt. Wolves were perfectly equipped for that world. Their sense of smell far surpassed that of humans. Their hearing reached well beyond the limits of the human ear. They could detect environmental changes from greater distances, identify the presence of animals long before people noticed them, and react quickly to unusual activity around a camp. The wolves that lived near human settlements were often the first creatures to respond when danger approached. They reacted to predators moving closer. They noticed unfamiliar groups of people approaching. They sensed the movements of animal herds passing through the region. For a human group consisting of only a few dozen individuals, such early warnings were incredibly valuable. A signal detected in advance could help prepare for a hunt. It could also prevent a surprise attack. Sometimes, the line between life and death was nothing more than a few minutes of awareness before real danger arrived. What is remarkable is that humans did not need to evolve those abilities themselves. They simply had to live beside a species that had possessed them for a very long time. Yet no relationship can endure if the benefits flow in only one direction. The wolves were receiving something equally valuable, something nature rarely provides for free. Around human camps existed a source of resources far more reliable than most found in the wild. After every hunt, scraps of meat, bones, organs, and animal fat were often left behind. All of them represented rich sources of energy. In nature, any animal carcass quickly becomes the center of competition. Scavenging birds, rival predators, and countless opportunistic creatures compete for every available calorie. The wild has no concept of excess. Human camps, however, sometimes created rare opportunities. Part of the available food became easier to access for individuals bold enough to venture closer. The benefits extended beyond food, firelight, noise, and the constant presence of people unintentionally created a relatively safe buffer zone. Many large predators preferred to avoid areas occupied by humans. As a result, some wolf populations living near camps achieved higher survival rates than groups that remained entirely isolated from people. It was one of the great paradoxes of the Ice Age. Individuals living near another species sometimes gained advantages over those relying solely on nature. As those advantages became increasingly clear, the next transformation no longer occurred in the environment around them. It began inside the wolves themselves. Over many generations, wolves that reacted less aggressively toward humans tended to survive longer. Individuals that were more flexible in their social behavior often made better use of the opportunities surrounding human camps. Those capable of tolerating human presence faced fewer dangerous conflicts. Gradually, a unique group of animals emerged. They were not yet dogs in the modern sense. Their brains, bodies, and instincts still carried many characteristics of wolves. Yet they were no longer entirely like the wolf populations that lived far from humans. They stood between two worlds. They were learning to adapt to an environment unlike anything that had existed before in evolutionary history. An environment where the most important factor was no longer climate, terrain, or natural food sources, but the presence of human beings. Even more remarkable, the change was not happening in only one direction. Across thousands of years of continuous contact, both species were quietly shaping each other. Today, this process is known as coevolution. When two species live alongside one another long enough, every change in one creates a new adaptive pressure on the other. Early dogs gradually developed the ability to read human social signals. They became sensitive to eye direction, hand gestures, and facial expressions. In time, this would become one of the defining characteristics of the dog. At the same time, humans were learning to interpret them as well. They learned to recognize when an animal was alert, when it was frightened, and when it was trying to warn them of something. A new language was taking shape, one that required no words, yet allowed two biologically distinct species to understand one another. The history of the dog is therefore not simply the history of an animal. It is the history of one of the rarest biological relationships on Earth. Very few creatures have changed their destiny by forming such a deep connection with another species. What makes dogs extraordinary is not their speed, their strength, or even their hunting ability. What makes them unique is that they learned to adapt to humans, and humans, in turn, learned to adapt to them. Over the thousands of years that followed, that bond continued to deepen. The animals that once lingered beyond the edge of the firelight gradually entered everyday human life. The distance between the two species grew smaller with each passing generation, until one day, evidence emerged from beneath the ground, not on a hunting field, not among the remains of an ancient camp, but inside a grave, a place where a dog had been laid to rest beside a human, not as an animal, but as a true member of the family. How can we tell when an animal truly became a human companion? The question seems simple enough when viewed through the lens of the modern world. a dog sleeping at its owner's feet, racing to the door at the sound of familiar footsteps, or quietly sitting beside someone in a moment of sadness appears to answer it effortlessly. Yet if we travel back more than 14,000 years, the answer becomes far less obvious. What remains from that distant time is not memory, emotion, or behavior. All that survives are fragments of bone buried deep beneath the earth. Around 14,200 years ago, in the Rhine Valley of what is now Western Germany, the Ice Age was slowly drawing to a close. The massive glaciers that had dominated the north for tens of thousands of years were beginning to retreat. Human communities still lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across vast landscapes in search of food. Beside them were early dogs that had shared generations of life alongside people. Together, they endured brutal winters, took part in hunts that lasted for days, and faced the countless dangers of the late Pleistocene world. Interestingly, the most important evidence of that relationship did not appear on an ancient hunting ground or in a trail of fossilized footprints. It emerged from beneath the earth, inside a quiet grave hidden by time for thousands of years. When archaeologists excavated the Bonn Oberkassel site in 1914, they uncovered more than a set of human remains. Inside the late Stone Age burial lay 3 individuals placed together: an adult man, an adult woman, and a dog. The discovery immediately attracted the attention of researchers. In hunter-gatherer societies, burial was not something granted to every living creature. A deliberate grave reflected social value. It reflected the place an individual held within a community. What made this burial remarkable was that the dog had not been discarded outside the settlement. It had not been treated as the remains of a working animal whose usefulness had ended. Instead, it was placed beside humans within the same burial space. The act feels like a quiet message sent from the distant past. At least for the people who lived at Bonn Oberkassel more than 14,000 years ago. This animal meant far more than simple practical value. Yet what truly astonished researchers was not the location of the skeleton. The greater secret was hidden within the dog's own body. Decades after the original excavation, modern analyses of its bones and teeth revealed an unexpected story. The dog had suffered from a serious illness while still young. Biological evidence suggests it may have endured a viral disease similar to canine distemper, an illness capable of causing high fever, severe weakness, neurological problems, and the loss of normal function. For a dog living in the wild, such a condition would have been almost a death sentence. It is important to remember the reality of that time. There were no dependable food stores, no secure shelters, no medicine. A young animal weakened by disease, unable to hunt or move effectively, would have had little chance of surviving a harsh winter or the fierce competition of the natural world. Yet the evidence told a different story. Growth patterns preserved in the teeth and bones revealed that the dog did not die immediately after becoming ill. It survived for weeks, perhaps even months. That raises an obvious question. Who kept it alive? A weakened animal couldn't obtain enough food on its own for such a long period. It needed to be fed. It needed protection. It needed care at a time when its body could no longer withstand the challenges of the surrounding environment. That means that within a community already struggling each day to survive, someone shared valuable food resources with a sick dog. They invested time and attention in an individual that could no longer contribute directly to a hunt. It was a remarkable moment in the history of the relationship between the two species. A survival decision had become an emotional one. When a tool breaks and is no longer useful, it is usually replaced. When a living creature continues to receive care despite offering no immediate benefit, it reflects a completely different way of thinking. That dog was no longer valued solely as a hunting assistant. It was valued for its own presence. Perhaps for the first time that archaeology can clearly identify. Humans were caring for a dog not because of what it could do, but because of what it was. Born Oberkassel is not the only example. As excavations continued across the Levant, Siberia, the Lake Baikal region, and parts of East Asia, archaeologists repeatedly uncovered ancient dog burials that showed clear signs of intention. Some dogs were buried alone. Others were laid to rest beside their owners. In certain cases, the positioning of the remains suggested that burial rituals had been carefully prepared. Despite being separated by vast distances, these discoveries share a common thread. They reveal a transformation that occurred not within dogs, but within the human mind. Throughout evolutionary history, humans lived alongside countless animals. Reindeer provided food and hides. Horses later offered transportation. Many large mammals contributed to the survival of ancient communities. Yet dogs were among the first species to enter a different kind of space. A space of social attachment. A space of emotion. A true relationship does not begin when two sides simply share food. It begins when one side is willing to care for the other, even when no direct benefit is expected in return. Beneath the soil of Bonn Oberkassel, an ancient grave preserved evidence of that moment for more than 14,000 years. Not the moment humans domesticated dogs, but the moment humans began to see dogs as companions. While some dogs were being buried beside humans in Europe, other populations were traveling with their owners toward new lands. Ice was retreating across Eurasia. Migration routes were opening wider with each passing century. Ahead of dogs lay the greatest journey in their entire history. If every dog alive on Earth today can trace its origins back to the early dog populations that emerged after the first stages of domestication, what created the astonishing gap between a husky thriving in the Arctic ice and a tiny Chihuahua living in warm climates, the answer does not lie in a single moment. It lies in thousands of years of separation, adaptation, and companionship alongside humans across the world. Between roughly 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, Earth entered a period of profound transformation. The Ice Age was gradually coming to an end. Vast sheets of ice that had once covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt and retreat. The familiar landscapes of the frozen world changed century by century. The immense grasslands that had once stretched uninterrupted to the horizon became fragmented. Forests expanded into newly opened territories. Wetlands appeared where cold, dry steppes had once dominated. Rivers fed by melting glaciers carved out new paths, creating natural boundaries that had never existed before. These changes affected more than wildlife alone. Human hunter-gatherer groups also began to alter the way they lived. Communities that had once traveled through the same ecological corridors slowly drifted apart. Some moved westward, others pushed north. Some followed great river systems, while others ventured into newly formed forests. Every direction led to a different world, shaped by different challenges. Dogs did not remain behind. They traveled with the people who had raised, accepted, and lived alongside them for generations. As human groups split and spread across new lands, the evolutionary history of dogs began to branch as well. Every human migration became a turning point for the dog populations that accompanied them. In Europe, warming temperatures allowed forests to expand rapidly. The great reindeer herds that had sustained Ice Age hunters gradually retreated northward. In their place came red deer, elk, wild boar, and countless species adapted to woodland environments. For the dogs that accompanied hunting groups in these regions, the New World demanded new skills. On open plains, success depended heavily on speed and the ability to spot prey from great distances. Inside dense forests, visibility was limited by trees and undergrowth. Dogs increasingly relied on scent rather than sight, following invisible trails left behind by animals hidden from view. They became more skilled at navigating natural obstacles and worked more closely with humans during the hunt. Farther north, an entirely different world persisted. Large parts of Siberia and the Arctic remained cold for thousands of years after much of the planet had begun to warm. Reindeer still crossed vast stretches of tundra. Musk oxen endured the harsh conditions. In isolated regions, some of the last surviving mammoths still lingered. The dogs living in these environments faced relentless cold, long migrations, and scarce food resources. Over many generations, traits such as endurance, cold resistance, thick coats, and efficient movement across snow became increasingly important. These were likely the earliest foundations of the Arctic dog lineages that would later become famous throughout the world. Yet the journey of dogs did not remain confined to Eurasia. Some populations were entering lands that had seen little or no human presence throughout most of earlier history, at a time when sea levels were far lower than they are today. A vast land bridge connected Siberia and Alaska. This corridor formed a natural pathway between two continents. Human hunting groups from Northeast Asia crossed it carrying their tools, their knowledge, their survival strategies, and their four-legged companions. They moved through Beringia, entered Alaska, crossed northern Canada, and gradually spread throughout the Americas. When sea levels eventually rose again, the connection disappeared. The dog populations of the New World became isolated from the rest of the world for a very long time. That isolation sent them down a path of their own. Across thousands of years, the earliest dogs of the Americas developed into a distinct genetic branch. Traces of this ancient lineage can still be found in some indigenous dog populations of Central and South America today, like faint memories preserved from a migration that took place in a distant prehistoric past. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of Eurasia, another center of diversity was quietly emerging. East Asia possessed an extraordinary variety of environments: temperate forests, subtropical regions, mountain ranges, coastal plains, and vast river basins all existed within a relatively connected landscape. Each environment imposed different selective pressures. A dog population living along the coast faced challenges entirely different from those experienced by dogs in mountain valleys or inland forests. As a result, dogs in this region did not evolve along a single path. They gradually diversified, creating a rich reservoir of genetic variation that endured for millennia. The most surprising discovery emerged only when modern technology made it possible to recover and analyze DNA from ancient dog remains excavated across different parts of the world. When these pieces of evidence were assembled, an entirely new picture began to emerge. Around 11,000 years ago, dogs were no longer a single, uniform population. At least 5 major ancestral lineages already existed in different regions of the world. These were not yet huskies, German shepherds, border collies, or chihuahuas. Those familiar breeds still lay far in the future. Instead, these 5 ancestral branches represented deep genetic foundations, the earliest roots of the extraordinary diversity that would emerge thousands of years later. Each lineage reflected a different environment, a different survival strategy, and a different form of cooperation with humans. What makes this especially remarkable is how early this diversity appeared. It emerged before agriculture became widespread, before the first cities were built, and before the rise of the earliest states. Even at that stage, the evolutionary history of dogs was already far more complex than anyone had once imagined. As scientists continued to study the canine genetic map, they uncovered something even more profound. Nearly every major human migration left traces in the DNA of the dogs that traveled alongside those people. Ancient roots, encounters between distant communities, and exchanges that unfolded across generations were all preserved within the genetic record of dogs. Following the history of dogs is much like tracing an alternative map of human history. What first appears to be 2 separate stories gradually merges into a single shared journey. Some creatures do more than witness history. They become part of it. When we look into the genetic legacy carried by modern dogs, we are not simply looking at the history of an animal species. We are seeing journeys across continents, partings and reunions, newly discovered lands, and the enduring human drive to survive. At first, dogs merely lived beside humans. Then they crossed continents and ages together. Soon, an entirely new possibility would begin to emerge. Not merely companions, not merely guardians. Dogs and humans were about to become true partners in the hunt, forming a relationship that would reshape the destiny of both species for thousands of years to come. What made dogs the most successful hunting partners in all of human history? The answer does not lie in overwhelming strength or unmatched speed. In fact, many animals are faster than dogs, stronger than dogs, or far more dangerous than dogs. The secret lies in something far rarer in nature: the ability to work closely with an entirely different species. Between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, the world was undergoing another profound transformation. The Ice Age was steadily retreating across much of the northern hemisphere. The vast grasslands that had once stretched to the horizon began to change. Mixed forests spread across new regions. Coniferous woodlands covered colder landscapes. Wetlands expanded along newly formed river valleys. The terrain became more complex, more enclosed, and far more difficult to read. For hunters, this created an entirely new challenge. On the open plains of earlier times, people could spot prey from great distances and organize long pursuits across unobstructed terrain. In the new environment, everything became more difficult. A deer could disappear after only a few strides into the forest. A herd might suddenly change direction behind dense vegetation. Visual clues that had once been reliable became increasingly uncertain. Humans began to need an ability they themselves barely possessed: the ability to experience the world through scent. It was within this changing landscape that the four-legged companions following hunter-gatherer groups began to take on a new role. They were no longer simply animals living near people. They became true hunting partners. The biological differences between humans and dogs created two remarkably different ways of experiencing the world. A dog's nose contains hundreds of millions of scent receptors, while humans possess only a fraction of that number. What appears to us as empty space is filled with information for a dog. A deer moves through a forest in the early morning. Within minutes, it has vanished from the hunter's sight. No movement remains between the trees. No sounds emerge from the undergrowth. Yet for a dog, the animal is still present everywhere. Its scent lingers on leaves, on damp soil, on bent blades of grass, even within the currents of air moving through the forest. For the first time in history, humans could search using a sense that was not their own. From that point forward, hunters no longer depended entirely on their eyes. They learned to watch the reactions of their dogs. They learned to interpret the signals detected by a dog's nose. Gradually, a unique partnership emerged. Two species began functioning as a single system rather than as separate creatures. In Siberia, Northern Europe, and the sub-Arctic regions, that relationship continued to evolve in new directions. Here, reindeer became one of the most important food sources. Massive herds numbering in the hundreds crossed enormous landscapes. When threatened, they could easily split apart and scatter in multiple directions. Under these conditions, dogs did not necessarily need to bring down the prey themselves. Their value lay in far more subtle tasks. They helped locate herds from great distances. They maintained the movement of the animals in predictable directions. They prevented chaotic dispersal and created opportunities for hunters to approach from favorable positions. What is remarkable is that dogs often did not replace human work. They made that work possible. A hunt that might otherwise have been nearly impossible became a realistic opportunity because of the presence of these four-legged partners. Farther south, within the dense forests of post-Ice Age Europe, the challenge took a different form. Red deer, elk, and wild boar often remained hidden among layers of thick vegetation. Hunters rarely saw the animals directly. They noticed only faint tracks in soft soil, a freshly broken branch, or disturbed leaves on the forest floor. To a dog, these signs were like a detailed map. They could follow scent trails lingering on the ground, detect the direction of odors carried by the wind, determine where an animal had passed, and predict where it was heading. These remarkable tracking abilities likely emerged very early in the history of domestication and were strengthened over countless generations through human selection. Yet not every hunt targeted large animals. As human communities gradually became more settled, food needs became increasingly diverse. Rabbits, foxes, martens, and many smaller animals grew more important in everyday life. To meet these new demands, some dog populations began developing different characteristics. They became smaller, more agile, and quicker to react. These dogs could dive into dense brush, flush prey from hiding places, and drive animals into areas where humans could reach them. This marked an important turning point. Not all dogs were doing the same work anymore. Some excelled at tracking. Some specialized in locating prey. Others proved especially effective at pursuit or guarding. The first stages of specialization were quietly underway. For thousands of years after domestication, most dogs still performed multiple roles. Over time, however, humans began noticing that certain individuals were exceptionally skilled at specific tasks. Those dogs were more likely to be kept, protected, and given opportunities to reproduce. No one at the time understood genetics. No one knew about genes or artificial selection. Yet a powerful selective pressure had already begun to shape the future. Useful traits passed from one generation to the next. The earliest foundations of scent hounds, sight hounds, herding dogs, guardian dogs, and sled dogs were being laid during this period. But the deepest discovery of this era was not about hunting skill. It was about the relationship forming between two species. Humans are not the fastest creatures on Earth. Dogs are not the strongest predators. Yet when they worked together, each compensated perfectly for what the other lacked. Humans contributed strategy, tools, and complex social cooperation. Dogs contributed extraordinary senses of smell and hearing, along with tracking abilities that extended far beyond human limits. The result was a hunting system far more effective than either species could achieve alone. This is not merely a story of domestication. It is a story of a rare form of behavioral symbiosis, in which two species expanded one another's capabilities. Some relationships in nature are not built upon similarity. They are built upon differences that complement each other perfectly. At first, dogs were simply creatures following ancient human groups. Then they became companions in the hunt. Yet the journey was far from over. As communities grew larger, as territories began to be defended, and as the first conflicts emerged, some dogs would step into an entirely new role. They would no longer be hunters alone. They would become the first warriors to stand beside humankind. Today, the image most people have of a dog is a familiar one, curled up on a sofa, resting quietly beside a fireplace, happily chasing a ball across a park. Modern life makes it easy to forget that for a very long stretch of history, dogs belonged to entirely different places. Their barking did not echo through peaceful neighborhoods. It carried across ranks of raised spears, mixed with the thunder of hooves and the clash of metal on ancient battlefields. From roughly the first millennium BCE through the early centuries of the Common Era, the world was changing at an extraordinary pace. Small bands of hunters gradually grew into city-states, then sprawling kingdoms, and eventually vast empires stretching across continents. Along with that expansion came constant conflict. War was no longer an occasional event. It became a familiar part of political life. Armies grew larger, campaigns reached farther. The need to defend territory became greater than ever before. Within this changing world, dogs were given a new responsibility. For thousands of years, they had helped humans confront dangerous animals. Now they were asked to protect people from one another. Long before Roman legions marched along the stone roads for which they would later become famous, four-legged warriors were already serving in the lands between the great rivers of Mesopotamia. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE, The Neo-Assyrian Empire emerged as one of the most formidable military powers of the ancient world. In cities such as Nineveh and Nimrud, carved reliefs on palace walls still preserve images of enormous dogs standing beside soldiers and accompanying royal hunting expeditions. Their appeal was not elegance, it was power. Massive heads, thick necks, deep chests, and heavily built bodies reveal animals shaped to withstand extreme physical demands. Many researchers believe they were closely related to ancient Mastiff-type dogs that were widespread throughout the Near East. What makes their story especially interesting is that war was not their original purpose. They were trained to confront some of the most dangerous creatures known to the people of Mesopotamia. Asian lions, powerful wild equids, and large predators capable of seriously injuring humans were among the challenges they faced. Once a dog possessed the courage to charge an enraged lion and the strength to stand against the claws and jaws of an apex predator, another use became obvious. The Assyrians quickly realized that the same fearlessness used against wild animals could also serve on the battlefield. A quiet transformation began. The enemy was no longer a beast of the wilderness, but the infantry formations of rival kingdoms. If Assyria laid some of the earliest foundations for the image of the war dog, Greece created a symbol whose influence would last far longer. In Epirus, in northwestern Greece, a famous line of dogs known as the Molossus emerged. What is striking is that contemporary accounts rarely focused on their color or even their size. Instead, people remembered what they did. They stood between livestock and predators. They rushed forward when danger appeared. They refused to retreat when attacked. Those actions built the reputation of the Molossus throughout the Greek world. At first, their task was to protect herds from wolves and other predators. Yet as warfare became an increasingly common reality among the Greek city-states, that protective instinct was redirected toward defending human lives. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Molossus is that its influence did not end with its own era. For centuries, the name itself became almost synonymous with large guardian dogs. While the exact connections remain debated, many experts believe part of their legacy may still be reflected in some modern guarding breeds renowned for their strength and protective instincts. Yet the empire that carried these four-legged warriors farther than any other was not Greece. It was Rome. From the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE, Roman influence spread across the Mediterranean, Europe, North Africa, and Asia Minor. Every land absorbed into the empire brought more than wealth and resources. It also contributed unique animals, including dog lines celebrated for their strength, endurance, and loyalty. The Roman military was famous for its organization. To them, dogs were not merely weapons. They were a living and remarkably reliable warning system. Dogs guarded camps. They patrolled at night. They protected food stores. They pursued fugitives. They detected surprise raids before human senses could. Some wore protective metal collars fitted with spikes. Their primary purpose was not to make the dogs more terrifying. Instead, these collars helped protect the neck during attacks or encounters with dangerous animals. Most importantly, the greatest value of dogs within the Roman military often had little to do with offensive power. Their true strength lay in their ability to sense danger before humans could. It was a skill refined over tens of thousands of years alongside people, from the cold nights around Ice Age campfires to the sprawling camps of powerful Roman legions. Looking back across this entire journey, what history remembers about war dogs is not simply the battles they fought. The deeper significance lies in how their role evolved. From hunting companions tracking prey across wild landscapes, from guardians watching over small camps on the edge of the wilderness, they entered perhaps the harshest environment humans ever created: war. Yet one thing never changed. Whether in the frozen forests that followed the Ice Age or amid the dust and smoke of Mediterranean battlefields, dogs remained at humanity's side. Few animals willingly step into danger alongside another species. Even fewer make that choice generation after generation for thousands of years. War dogs therefore reflect more than the military history of ancient civilizations. They reveal the depth of a relationship that was forged long before the first city walls were raised and long before the first empires appeared on any map. Loyalty is not created during peaceful times. It becomes most visible when a living creature still chooses to stay beside you, even as danger approaches from the horizon. But not every challenge in the history of dogs unfolded on a battlefield. Far to the north, where snow covered the ground for much of the year, where distance was measured in days of travel through ice and bitter winds, another group of dogs was preparing to open the next chapter in this 30,000-year journey. Their legacy would not be written through war. It would be written through their ability to pull an entire civilization across a world of snow and ice. If you had to survive in a land where winter temperatures could plunge below -40 degrees, where the sun disappeared beneath the horizon for weeks at a time, where a single snowstorm could erase every trace of a trail within minutes, what would you rely on to stay alive? There were no roads, no engines, no supply stations, no rescue teams appearing in the distance. Only ice, wind, and an endless white expanse stretching beyond the limits of sight. For thousands of years, the people living around the Arctic Circle faced that question every single day. The Inuit of Greenland, the Yupik of Alaska, and the Chukchi of Siberia were separated by oceans, frozen landscapes, and vast geographic distances. Yet they all arrived at the same answer. It was not a metal tool. It was not a mechanical invention. It was the dog. For roughly 9,500 years, and continuing into the modern era, sled dogs formed the foundation of survival for many Arctic cultures. In that world, wheels were almost useless. Deep snow, jagged ice, and frozen seas made conventional transportation ineffective. A team of sled dogs, by contrast, could travel across terrain that humans could scarcely cross alone. They hauled food, they carried hunting equipment, they transported materials for shelter. In many cases, they carried the very survival of communities scattered across the coldest regions on Earth. To understand why dogs became so essential, we must travel back to northeastern Siberia, on the Chukotka Peninsula, near the Bering Sea. One of the most remarkable relationships between humans and animals gradually took shape. The Chukchi lived in a world where distance was not measured in kilometers, but in days spent traveling across snow. Hunting reindeer, seals, and walruses required constant movement across immense stretches of tundra. They needed a dependable means of transportation. There were no horses, no cattle, no large domestic animals suited to Arctic conditions. The only creature capable of meeting that challenge was the dog. What makes their story especially fascinating is how they chose their companions. The dogs that were kept were not necessarily the strongest individuals. An animal that was too aggressive could throw an entire sled team into chaos. A dog that couldn't cooperate might slow the group when a blizzard was approaching. Generation after generation, preference was given to dogs that tolerated cold exceptionally well, consumed energy efficiently, maintained a steady pace over long distances, and, perhaps most importantly, worked well with others. Over time, endurance became the most valuable trait of all. Not explosive speed for a few minutes. The ability to keep moving after hours, and even days, of travel through freezing winds and endless snow. That process of selection, repeated over thousands of years, laid the groundwork for the Arctic sled dog lines we know today, including the ancestors of the modern Siberian Husky. Yet Siberia is not the only place where echoes of that ancient world remain. On the far side of the Arctic Ocean, another ancient lineage still survives, like a doorway into the distant past. In Greenland, particularly among northern Inuit communities, people continue to keep a dog known as the Kimek. At first glance, many people mistake them for wolves. Their thick coats, powerful features, and confident gait give them an unusually primitive appearance. But what truly makes the Kimek remarkable lies deep within its DNA. Genetic studies have shown that it is one of the oldest surviving sled dog populations in the world. Its genetic makeup bears an astonishing resemblance to that of an ancient sled dog that lived roughly 9,500 years ago on Zhukov Island in Arctic Siberia. That means when we look at a Chimek today, we are looking at a lineage that has traveled alongside humans since the earliest days of the Holocene. Unlike many modern breeds that have undergone countless rounds of crossbreeding, the Kimek remained relatively isolated for centuries. That isolation unintentionally turned the breed into a living biological archive. Within its genes survive ancient traits that most other dogs lost long ago. Yet the genetic legacy of sled dogs takes us even further back than the first Arctic communities. When scientists began decoding the genomes of sled dog populations, they discovered traces of ancestry that do not come from modern wolf populations. Instead, some of these genetic signatures belong to ancient Ice Age wolves that vanished from the earth long ago. It is a remarkable discovery. A portion of the genetic material that once existed on the frozen grasslands where mammoths wandered is still alive today. Not in fossils buried beneath permafrost, not in ancient skeletons recovered by archaeologists, but inside living animals that continue to run across snowfields and pull sleds through the northern winds. Genes linked to cold tolerance, efficient energy metabolism, sustained physical exertion, and adaptation to diets rich in protein and fat have been preserved across thousands of years. Those traits did more than help dogs survive. They helped save human lives. In 1925, a diphtheria outbreak threatened the town of Nome, Alaska. The life-saving serum was located far away. Aircraft could not fly because of extreme weather. Sea routes were blocked by ice. Every familiar means of transportation had failed. Only one option remained. Sled dog teams raced into the Arctic night. They pushed through fierce winds, deep snow, and brutal cold. One team pass the serum to the next in a relay that stretched across nearly impassable terrain. Names like Balto and Togo would become famous. Yet the truly extraordinary part of the story is that the event was not a miracle that appeared out of nowhere. It was the result of a tradition that had been evolving for thousands of years, beginning with ancient hunters living in the Arctic. The true importance of sled dogs becomes most visible in moments like these. If war dogs symbolize courage, sled dogs symbolize endurance. For most of human history, the Arctic was never conquered through overwhelming force. People survived there through cooperation. These dogs did not defeat the blizzards. They learned how to live with them. Then, through their quiet presence, they helped humans learn the same lesson. Evolution does not always create the strongest creature. Sometimes it creates creatures capable of staying beside one another long enough to reach places that neither could reach alone. Yet humans would eventually discover an even stranger ability hidden within dogs. Not every herd of animals needed to be hunted. Some herds needed to be guided. And so dogs began learning a skill possessed by very few species on Earth: the ability to control hundreds of other animals using nothing more than movement, eye contact, and their own presence. How can a dog weighing less than 20 kilograms control a flock of hundreds of sheep without biting, without charging into them, and sometimes without even touching a single animal? At first glance, it seems to defy everything we think we know about power. A large flock of sheep can outweigh a herding dog by dozens, even hundreds of times. Yet across the grasslands of Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East over the past 8,000 years, this scene has become one of the most familiar sights in human life. After tens of thousands of years spent relying on hunting, many human communities entered an entirely different chapter of their history. They no longer survived solely by following wild herds across plains and mountains. Instead, they began keeping useful animals close, raising them through generations, and gradually building larger and larger herds. Sheep, goats, cattle, and eventually horses became an increasingly common presence around human settlements. That shift created an entirely new challenge. How do you manage hundreds of animals at the same time? How do you keep them from scattering in every direction? How do you protect them from predators waiting beyond the edges of the pasture? No shepherd could spend every hour of the day chasing individual animals. Once again, dogs became the answer. This time, however, their task was no longer to pursue prey. They were given a role far more subtle. They had to control an entire moving herd. What makes this remarkable is that the skill was not created from nothing. Its roots stretch back to a much older inheritance, one that existed long before dogs, when wolf ancestors still wandered through the frozen landscapes of the Ice Age. A wolf hunt rarely begins with a sudden attack. It begins with observation. A wolf spots its target from a distance, approaches quietly, watches patiently, and gradually influences the prey's direction of movement. Only after many stages of preparation do the chase and the final killing bite arrive. Over thousands of years of selective breeding, humans unintentionally created something extraordinary. They favored individuals that showed strong tendencies to observe, focus intensely, stalk, control movement, and react to the motions of a group. Meanwhile, animals that were more likely to attack and kill livestock were not chosen to continue breeding. The result was a behavioral pattern almost unknown in nature. These dogs still feel the urge to control movement. They still want to circle, guide, and maintain order within a group of animals. But the drive to kill prey has been weakened or removed through countless generations. That is why an entire flock of sheep can change direction simply because a dog is standing in the right place. No furious barking is required. No physical contact is necessary. The dog's presence alone creates enough pressure to influence the behavior of the entire flock. From this unique behavioral foundation, several remarkable herding breeds began to emerge. Among the most famous is the Border Collie, a breed closely associated with the border region between Scotland and England during the 18th and 19th centuries. Across the vast hills of the border country, shepherds were responsible for livestock spread across difficult terrain. A single person could not watch every direction at once. They needed a partner intelligent enough to make decisions independently. The Border Collie never became famous because of its size or strength. What sets it apart is its extraordinary ability to process information. It constantly tracks the position of different groups of sheep, the distance between the flock and the shepherd, the shape of the terrain ahead, and even subtle changes in movement throughout the herd. While many dogs react to situations as they unfold, Border Collies often seem to anticipate them before they happen. Their most famous characteristic is known simply as the eye. It is an intense, unwavering stare paired with a low posture and slow, deliberate movement. That gaze creates a psychological pressure that livestock instinctively respond to, guiding them in the desired direction, not through physical force, but through an exceptional ability to influence the behavior of other animals. For this reason, the Border Collie is often regarded as one of the most intelligent and capable working dogs ever documented. But not every herd lives among the green hills of Scotland. Across the Atlantic, the vast landscapes of the American West demanded a different kind of partner. The Australian Shepherd emerged in that environment, despite its name. The breed was refined in the United States. It developed alongside livestock workers moving through California, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and many other wide-open regions. If the Border Collie is a specialist in precision control, the Australian Shepherd is the manager of long journeys. It possesses remarkable endurance, quick reactions, and the ability to work continuously for hours. Sheep, goats, and cattle spread across enormous ranches were guided by dogs capable of adapting to a wide range of conditions. Every step in this process reveals something important. Humans were not merely changing the appearance of dogs. They were reshaping some of the deepest instincts inside the canine brain. A wolf once used its stare to lock onto prey. Thousands of years later, a Border Collie uses that same stare to protect a flock of sheep. A predator once learned how to separate animals from a herd in order to hunt. Today, that very skill is used to keep the herd together. Perhaps the most astonishing part of the story is not how much dogs have changed. Perhaps it is the fact that an ancient instinct can be given an entirely new purpose. Behaviors that once served the hunt have become tools of cooperation between humans and animals. Evolution does not always create completely new abilities. Sometimes it quietly assigns old abilities a new role, one better suited to a changing world. Yet eventually, humans discovered another canine talent even more remarkable than the ability to control a herd. That talent did not lie in speed or powerful legs. It was hidden inside the nose. A nose capable of detecting traces invisible to human eyes, sensing signals that people completely overlook, and gradually becoming a tool that would transform criminal investigations, rescue operations, and even modern medicine itself. If the human sense of smell is like reading a short sentence on a sheet of paper, then a dog's world of scent is more like an immense library filled with countless invisible books, all opened at the same time. When someone walks along a dirt path, we may notice that they were there if a familiar scent still lingers in the air. A dog senses far more than that. It can often tell how long ago the person passed by, which direction they were moving, whether they were accompanied by another animal, and even what physiological changes may be taking place inside their body. For most of the history shared by humans and dogs, the value of these animals was measured through visible tasks. They ran beside hunters through deep forests. They pulled sleds across endless snowfields. They stood guard over villages, protected livestock from predators, and accompanied humans into war. Their strength, endurance, and loyalty made them one of civilization's most important partners. Yet over time, people began to recognize something astonishing. The greatest gift dogs possessed was not always found in their legs or their teeth. It was hidden in their noses. Humans possess only a few million scent receptors. Many dog breeds possess hundreds of millions. Their brains also dedicate a much larger proportion of processing power to smell than the human brain does. This difference creates two completely different ways of experiencing the world. Where we perceive a scent as a single impression, dogs can separate it into countless layers of information. A person is no longer one smell. To a dog, that individual is a combination of skin odor, sweat, breath, the microorganisms living on the body, traces left behind on clothing, and a vast collection of chemical compounds produced by the body's current state of health. Every individual becomes a unique chemical fingerprint. No two people are exactly alike in that invisible world of scent. This extraordinary ability gave rise to some of history's first true tracking specialists. In the vast forests of medieval Europe, when the footprints of deer or wild boar had vanished beneath fallen leaves, when human eyes could no longer find anything to follow, certain dogs continued moving forward with remarkable certainty. Among the most famous was the bloodhound. At first glance, the bloodhound is not the fastest dog, nor does it resemble a fearsome warrior. Yet its nose seems capable of reading invisible stories left behind on the ground. Every step taken by a living creature leaves microscopic traces behind. Tiny skin cells, colonies of microorganisms, and countless airborne organic compounds settle into the environment. Wind scatters them. Rain alters them. Sunlight gradually breaks them down. Even so, the trail does not disappear immediately. Bloodhounds learn to connect these scattered signals into a continuous path. What appears to humans as empty ground becomes, for them, a detailed map complete with a starting point, a direction of travel, and countless subtle clues left behind. This ability has made the bloodhound one of the most respected tracking dogs in the world. in many investigations and search operations. Its nose has become a tool people trust with remarkable confidence. As modern cities expanded, the work of dogs continued to evolve. Hunting forests gradually gave way to airports, seaports, border crossings, and crowded urban centers. The world became more complex. Crime became more sophisticated. Humans developed increasingly advanced technology. Yet certain tasks remain difficult to replace entirely with machines. Amid the thousands of competing odors inside an international airport, dogs can be trained to detect incredibly small amounts of chemicals released by explosives, narcotics, hidden cash, and many other specialized materials. What makes this remarkable is that dogs do not recognize a bomb or a package in the way humans imagine. Instead, they recognize the chemical particles quietly drifting through the air. It is a language their noses learned to read long before humans invented modern sensors. These noses do more than protect cities. They save lives during humanity's most fragile moments. After earthquakes, avalanches, or major structural collapses, the greatest challenge is often not the lack of rescue workers. The real difficulty lies in finding exactly where survivors remain trapped beneath tons of debris. In those moments of chaos, German shepherds, Labrador retrievers, and golden retrievers step into an entirely different role. They search for breath. They search for body scent. They search for tiny chemical signals released by a living human being. Those signals drift through narrow cracks, pass through snow, soil, stone, and concrete, and rise toward the surface. In many cases, rescue dogs locate survivors before sophisticated detection equipment can. When a bark echoes across a disaster site, it often marks the moment hope returns to families waiting desperately for news. Yet the story does not end there. In recent decades, hospitals and research institutions have begun documenting observations that are even more difficult to explain. Some dogs repeatedly focus on the same area of their owner's body. They sniff it for unusually long periods, lick it persistently, or refuse to leave it alone. Medical examinations have sometimes revealed serious health conditions precisely where the dog had shown interest. Diseased cells do not simply change the body internally. They also produce distinctive chemical compounds that can be released through breath, sweat, or urine. These signals are too subtle for humans to detect directly. Yet they sometimes fall within the range of a dog's remarkable sense of smell. The ability to identify certain forms of cancer, recognize dangerous drops in blood sugar, or warn of an approaching seizure has opened an entirely new field of research connecting medicine and the invisible world of scent. Even so, some mysteries remain unresolved. Across many parts of the world, unusual canine behavior has been reported before major natural events such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. One theory suggests that dogs may detect tiny vibrations, low-frequency sounds, or physical changes that fall beyond the limits of human perception. Even today, the answer remains uncertain. That uncertainty leads to a fascinating realization. After more than 15,000 years of walking through history together, humans still do not fully understand the world dogs experience every day. Throughout the rise of civilization, humanity has created countless tools. From the first stone blades to the wheel, the compass, the engine, and the computer. Yet one of the most powerful tools humanity has ever possessed was never built in a workshop or designed inside a laboratory. It walked toward our ancestors' campfires tens of thousands of years ago and chose to stay. Sometimes the greatest advance of a civilization is not something it creates. Sometimes it is a living companion it learns how to listen to. And then humans began to imagine an even bolder possibility. If dogs could become hunters, warriors, sled pullers, shepherds, and rescuers through selection carried out across countless generations, what might happen if we deliberately shaped their future? What happens when humanity no longer waits for nature to make all the decisions? A new chapter was beginning to emerge. For the first time in history, evolution would no longer be the only force making the choices. If someone living at the end of the Ice Age were suddenly shown a Chihuahua standing beside a Great Dane, they would probably assume they were looking at two completely different animals. One is so small, it can rest comfortably in a person's arms. The other stands nearly as tall as a young horse, with a massive frame and strikingly long legs. The contrast seems far too extreme for both to belong to the same species. And yet, they are both dogs. To understand how such a thing became possible, we have to return to a time when nature alone determined the fate of every living creature. Throughout the first tens of thousands of years in canine history, freezing temperatures, scarce food, disease, and predators acted as the relentless gatekeepers of evolution. Only the individuals best suited to their environment survived long enough to reproduce and pass their genes to the next generation. A dog that could run faster had a better chance of catching prey. A dog that tolerated cold more effectively could survive another winter. A dog that remained alert was more likely to avoid danger. Every trait that endured had been tested through countless generations in the wild. Then something changed in human history. Hunter-gatherer communities gradually began settling in permanent locations. The first villages appeared. Agriculture spread. Herds of livestock grew larger. Human life became more stable. And with that stability came new needs. People no longer needed dogs that were simply capable of surviving in nature. They needed dogs that could perform specific jobs. Some communities needed hunting companions. Others required dogs capable of protecting livestock from predators. People living in frozen northern regions relied on dogs to pull sleds across snow and ice. Growing settlements needed watchdogs that could warn of approaching danger. This was a remarkable moment in the history of evolution. For the first time, the power of selection began shifting from nature to humans. At first, nobody set out to create hundreds of different dog breeds. Nobody imagined dog shows, breed registries, or detailed standards of appearance. People simply kept the animals that proved most useful for their particular needs. Yet those seemingly simple choices launched one of the longest biological experiments in human history. Natural selection asks a very simple question: which individual survives? Best, humans began asking a different one: which individual is most useful? That small difference in the question led to an enormous difference in the outcome. Dogs with superior scenting abilities were chosen for hunting. Dogs that could manage and control livestock were favored as herders. The strongest animals were selected for pulling heavy loads. The most alert and loyal individuals were trusted to guard homes and property. Generation after generation, desired traits were repeated. They accumulated slowly within populations. What began as a small advantage became a defining characteristic. Given enough time, those characteristics shaped entirely distinct lines of dogs. This process unfolded unusually quickly compared with many other mammals. Dogs mature relatively fast, have shorter lifespans, and can produce fairly large litters. As a result, genetic changes can accumulate at remarkable speed. While some large animals may require hundreds or even thousands of years to show major differences, dogs can change noticeably in only a few dozen generations. But humans did not stop at selecting behavior and working ability. Gradually, they began paying attention to appearance. In the earliest stages, a dog's value was measured by what it could do. Over time, that value became increasingly tied to what it looked like. Floppy ears became desirable in some places. Short muzzles gained popularity in certain lines. Some communities favored dogs with shorter legs. Others preferred long, thick coats. Rare coat colors attracted attention. Extremely small or unusually large sizes became breeding goals in their own right. What makes this particularly fascinating is that many of these traits offered little advantage in the wild. Some would actually make survival more difficult. A dog that is too small would face serious risks in a natural environment. An excessively long coat can become a burden under many conditions. An extremely shortened muzzle may affect breathing, but under human protection, those limitations no longer carried the same consequences. For the first time in canine history, appearance became a selective force nearly as powerful as survival itself. By the 19th century, the process entered an entirely new phase. The Industrial Revolution was transforming societies across much of the world. Cities expanded. The middle class grew rapidly. Many families found themselves with more leisure time than previous generations. Dogs were no longer viewed solely as working animals. They became part of social and cultural life. Dog shows began to appear. Enthusiasts gathered to exchange knowledge and establish shared standards. Breed clubs were founded. Pedigrees were carefully recorded. Formal definitions of appearance, temperament, size, and color gradually emerged. Before this period, people generally spoke of hunting dogs, herding dogs, or guard dogs. Afterward, they began speaking about individual breeds, each with clearly recognized characteristics and standards. The results appeared with astonishing speed. In an evolutionary timeline stretching across tens of thousands of years, hundreds of modern breeds emerged in what was essentially a brief moment. The most surprising thing was not the number of breeds. It was the degree of difference between them. Why do wolves living at opposite ends of a continent still look broadly similar, while two dogs can appear so different that they seem unrelated? The answer lies in three unusual factors. The first is a short generation cycle. Dogs can reproduce within only a few years, allowing changes to accumulate rapidly. The second is intense human selection. Traits considered undesirable can disappear almost completely in only a handful of generations. The third is the presence of certain genes that exert a powerful influence over body size, leg length, skull shape, and coat structure. Relatively small genetic changes can produce dramatic physical differences. Because of these unique conditions, dogs have become the most morphologically diverse mammal managed by humans anywhere on Earth. From individuals weighing less than 2 kilograms to others exceeding 80 kilograms, all remain members of the same species and can still be traced back to a shared ancient origin. Viewed through the lens of history, this is not merely a story about dogs. It is also a story about the power of human imagination. In nature, the environment creates the pressures that determine who survives. In the history of dogs, humans gradually took on that role. They chose the sizes, shapes, behaviors, and purposes of generations that had not yet been born. For the first time in canine history, evolution was no longer guided primarily by snowfields, forests, deserts, or grasslands. It was increasingly guided by ideas held in the mind of another species. When a creature learns to reshape the world around it, that is often considered a sign of civilization. When that same creature learns to reshape an entirely different species according to its own vision, a completely new form of evolution begins to emerge, and that process would go far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. It produced animals small enough to fit in the palm of a hand and others nearly as tall as a young horse. No matter how different they appear, all still carry traces of the same distant ancestor, an ancient wolf that once stood beside human campfires tens of thousands of years ago. Imagine a fully grown animal that weighs only about 2 kilograms. It is small enough to rest comfortably in the palm of an adult's hands. Now imagine another animal weighing more than 80 kilograms, large enough to place its front paws on a grown person's shoulders and look them directly in the eye. In most of the animal kingdom, two creatures that different would almost certainly be classified as entirely separate species. Yet in this case, both share the same name: dog. It is one of the most astonishing paradoxes ever produced by domestication. After thousands of years alongside humans, dogs did not simply change their behavior. Their bodies were shaped in countless directions. Height increased or shrank. Weight shifted from generation to generation. Skulls became longer or shorter. Legs stretched for speed across open plains or shortened to navigate narrow tunnels. Differences that nature often distributes across multiple species emerged within a single one. If you want to see the smallest and largest extremes humans have created in canine history, you only need to look at the opposite ends of that spectrum. At one end stands the Chihuahua. At the other stands the Great Dane. In the region that is now Mexico, particularly around the area known as Chihuahua, a tiny dog emerged that would become the symbol of miniature size. Its origins are often linked to the Teichi, a small dog kept centuries ago by ancient civilizations of Central America. Images of little dogs appear on numerous archaeological artifacts, suggesting that they accompanied people long before the modern world existed. An adult Chihuahua usually stands between 15 and a little over 20 centimeters tall. Its weight may range from only 1.5 to 3 kilograms. Its rounded head and large eyes give it an appearance that seems permanently youthful. Beside many other breeds, a Chihuahua looks almost like a dog that has been reduced to an unbelievable scale. What is truly remarkable is that the gap between a Chihuahua and the largest dog breeds is far greater than most people imagine. An adult Chihuahua can sometimes weigh less than a single leg of a fully grown Great Dane. Among domesticated mammals, such an extreme difference in body size within a single species is exceptionally rare. Behind that miniature frame lies a series of subtle genetic changes. Certain genes involved in growth can produce effects far larger than their physical size would suggest. A few small adjustments in the biological mechanisms that regulate development are enough to create dogs of astonishingly small stature. It is a reminder that a tiny change in the genetic code can sometimes produce dramatic consequences in the visible world. If the Chihuahua represents the limit of shrinking, the opposite end of the spectrum is occupied by an animal that seems almost entirely different: the Great Dane. Over centuries in Central Europe, nobles and landowners sought dogs large enough to confront wild boar, guard estates, and protect property. Through the breeding of large hunting dogs and powerful mastiff lines, a giant gradually emerged. An adult Great Dane commonly weighs between 50 and 90 kilograms. Some exceptional individuals surpass 100 kilograms. Shoulder height can exceed 80 centimeters. Standing on their hind legs, many are taller than a fully grown person. If the Chihuahua resembles a masterpiece of miniaturization, the Great Dane feels like a creature enlarged nearly to the limit. Yet the most astonishing fact is not their difference. It is that biologically, they remain members of the same species. Under the right conditions, they can still produce offspring. This reality reveals something important about life itself. Physical appearance does not always reflect biological distance. Size, however, is only a small part of the story of canine diversity. Humans have reshaped dogs in ways that are even harder to believe. Consider the dachshund. This breed was developed to hunt burrowing animals such as badgers and foxes. Its entire body seems designed for a single purpose: a long torso, extremely short legs, and the ability to squeeze through narrow tunnels make it look very different from the ancient wolves from which dogs descended. Moving in a completely different direction, there is the greyhound. It is the embodiment of speed. Its deep chest, long legs, and powerful musculature allow it to reach speeds approaching 70 kilometers per hour. For a few brief seconds, a greyhound can accelerate with an efficiency that leaves many other animals behind. The bulldog tells yet another story. Its distinctive skull structure, powerful jaw, and shortened muzzle reflect a period in history when humans selected traits for very specific activities of their time. Simply looking at a bulldog's face reveals the mark of generations of deliberate selection. Far away in the mountains of Central Asia, the Afghan hound presents an almost opposite appearance. Its long, flowing coat is not merely decorative. In cold mountain environments swept by harsh winds, that coat once played an important role in survival. If you removed their breed names and placed a dachshund, greyhound, bulldog, and Afghan hound side by side, many people might assume they were looking at entirely different species. The diversity is so extraordinary that it is easy to forget they all trace back to the same distant ancestor. The secret lies beneath the fur, body shape, and size. Despite their dramatic physical differences, modern dog breeds remain genetically very similar. Most of their variation is concentrated in a relatively small number of genes that influence body size, skull shape, leg length, coat structure, and coloration. This creates a fascinating paradox. The genetic distance between a Chihuahua and a Great Dane is often far smaller than the genetic distance separating certain wild animals that appear outwardly similar. That is why Chihuahuas, Great Danes, Border Collies, and huskies are all classified within the same species, Canis lupus familiaris. From an evolutionary perspective, this is a remarkable phenomenon. Humans did not create hundreds of different dog species. They created hundreds of different expressions of the same species. Each breed is like an experiment conducted across generations, where some traits were preserved and others discarded until a body emerged that matched a particular purpose. So what are we really seeing when we look at the hundreds of modern dog breeds? Some were shaped to pursue prey across vast, open landscapes. Some were developed to guide livestock through rugged hills. Some pulled sleds across frozen snowfields. Some guarded homes and property. Others exist primarily as companions, sharing daily life with humans. Every breed is an answer to a specific need. Every physical trait is a trace of a historical circumstance, a different land, a different culture, a different way of understanding the world. When we look at a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, we are not simply looking at two dogs at opposite ends of a size spectrum. We are looking at thousands of years of accumulated human choices preserved within the body of a single animal species. Imagination, labor, survival, necessity, and even aesthetic preference have all left their marks on the canine genome. Evolution created the possibilities. Selection determined which possibilities would continue into the future. Among the hundreds of modern breeds, some display forms that emerged entirely through long periods of selective breeding. Yet others seem to preserve something much older, a memory of ice and snow, a memory of the frozen landscapes of the Ice Age, a memory of ancient wolves that once walked quietly beside the first human hunting bands. Traces of that distant past still survive today, hidden deep within the genomes of a handful of remarkable breeds. And it is those breeds that will lead us back toward the origins of this entire evolutionary journey. If time could leave fingerprints behind, some modern dog breeds are carrying those fingerprints in every cell of their bodies. On the surface, they are still familiar dogs, with the eyes, coats, and behaviors people have known for centuries. Yet deep within their DNA, they preserve fragments of memories from a distant age, when glaciers still covered vast regions of Earth and ancient wolf packs roamed across frozen grasslands. For most of human history, tracing the origins of dogs was like assembling a shattered picture from scattered pieces. Researchers relied on fossils, ancient carvings, archaeological discoveries, and historical records to reconstruct the story of humanity's oldest animal companion. But when DNA sequencing technology advanced rapidly in the early 21st century, an entirely new door opened. For the first time, scientists could place the genomes of modern dogs beside those of ancient dogs. They could compare them with living wolf populations and even with wolves that once existed during the Ice Age. What emerged was surprising. Not all modern dog breeds stand equally far from their ancient ancestors. Some lineages appear to have retained far more traces of very old genetic branches, like living chronicles that have somehow survived into the modern world. Among the names that repeatedly appear whenever scientists search for these ancient traces, the Siberian Husky is almost always near the top of the list. In northeastern Siberia, where winters can seem endless and temperatures can claim a human life within hours without proper preparation, the Chukchi people survived for thousands of years. Life in this environment allowed no waste, Every source of energy mattered. Every journey had to be carefully planned. In such a world, dogs were not merely pets. They were part of the survival system itself. The Chukchi did not select the most aggressive dogs or the most impressive-looking ones. They chose individuals that could pull sleds efficiently over long distances, conserve energy, cooperate with the pack, and maintain endurance through journeys that seemed to stretch forever across the snow. Through hundreds of generations of continuous selection, a remarkable line of dogs gradually emerged. That line became the Siberian Husky. When geneticists analyzed the Husky genome, they discovered that the breed belongs to an ancient Arctic lineage that diverged from many modern dog lines very early on. Some genetic signatures even appear linked to an ancient Siberian wolf population that lived roughly 35,000 years ago before disappearing from history. This does not mean that Huskies are wolves, nor does it mean they are wolf-dog hybrids. The real significance is that their DNA still carries pieces of history that have been diluted or lost in many other breeds. When we watch a team of Huskies pulling a sled across a field of snow, we are seeing more than a working dog. We are witnessing an evolutionary branch that began in the frozen landscapes of a distant age and continues to exist today. But if the Husky is a living memory of Siberia, another dog on the far side of the Arctic carries ancient traces that are no less remarkable. That dog is the Greenland dog, known among the Inuit as the Kimek. For centuries, Inuit life was inseparable from travel across snow and ice. They hunted seals on frozen seas, pursued caribou across cold plains, and transported supplies between settlements separated by hundreds of kilometers. The Kimek was an essential link in that entire system. Without these dogs, pulling sleds became far more difficult. Without them, transporting food across the Arctic was nearly impossible to do efficiently. The survival of many northern communities depended directly on the working abilities of their sled dog teams. What attracts scientific attention is the fact that Greenland dogs have retained a large number of ancient genetic characteristics found in early Arctic dog lineages. While many modern breeds have undergone extensive crossbreeding that blurred their ancestral signatures, the Kimek has preserved many ancient genetic segments across thousands of years. Some of those genetic traces are connected to ancient Siberian wolf populations that lived during the Ice Age. Again, this does not make the Greenland dog a wolf. Instead, it suggests that portions of its genome still contain chapters of history that have vanished from most modern dog breeds. To researchers studying ancient DNA, every Greenland dog is like a living biological archive. Within it are clues about Arctic migrations, the history of the Inuit people, and the extraordinary ways life adapts to one of the harshest environments on Earth. Yet ancient genetic traces are not found only in the Arctic. They also appear in another region that played a major role in the story of dogs: East Asia. When people think of the Shar-Pei, they often picture the breed's distinctive wrinkles. But what interests geneticists most is not its appearance. It is its DNA. When scientists map the evolutionary relationships among modern dog breeds, the Shar-Pei frequently appears among the ancient East Asian lineages. This suggests that its ancestors separated from many modern dog branches relatively early in canine evolutionary history. The significance of this discovery extends far beyond a single breed. East Asia has long been considered one of the key regions in the spread and diversification of early dogs. As a result, every surviving ancient breed from this region resembles a remaining piece of a much older puzzle, one that dates back to the earliest stages of domestication. There is, however, another group of dogs that blurs the line between past and present in a completely different way. The wolf dogs. Unlike huskies, Greenland dogs, or Shar-Peis, wolf dogs are not ancient lineages preserved through time. They are the products of modern breeding programs. During the 20th century, breeders in Europe intentionally crossed German shepherds with grey wolves in an effort to create animals that were stronger, more resilient, and still retained some wolf characteristics. From these efforts emerged breeds such as the Czechoslovakian wolf dog and the Saarloos wolf dog. These dogs genuinely carry a higher proportion of wolf DNA than most ordinary breeds. However, this is the result of relatively recent crossbreeding. That distinction is important. Huskies and Greenland dogs are not half-wolf creatures. They are ancient dog lineages that retain traces of deep history. Wolf dogs, by contrast, are the result of reintroducing wolf genes into dog populations in the modern era. The two stories are entirely different, even though they are often confused. So what do all these discoveries really tell us? When we look at a husky, a Greenland dog, a Shar-Pei, or other ancient dog lineages, we are not simply looking at different breeds. We are looking at layers of history stacked upon one another across thousands of years. One layer belongs to the Chukchi people living among the frozen landscapes of Siberia. Another belongs to Inuit communities surviving across the Arctic. Another belongs to the ancient villages of East Asia. Deeper still are the traces of the first dogs that once walked beside humans during the earliest days of domestication. Evolution does not always erase the past. Sometimes it simply hides it in places that are difficult to see. Within tiny stretches of DNA, ancient memories can survive for tens of thousands of years. These genomes are like silent time machines. They do not tell stories through words. They tell them through traces passed from one generation to the next, patiently enduring every upheaval of history. Yet no matter how many ancient memories these breeds carry, they remain products of natural history and thousands of years of selection. At certain moments, however, humans chose not to wait for history to shape dogs on its own. Instead, they began creating breeds for such specialized purposes that, if the records had not survived, we might easily believe those dogs existed only in imagination. One breed was developed to confront lions. Another spends much of its life searching for people buried beneath deep snow high in the mountains. Yet another stands guard over flocks through the darkness of the night, facing grey wolves, brown bears, and predators emerging from the shadows. If you looked only at their jobs, it would be hard to believe they all belong to the same species. And yet that is exactly what happened throughout the history of dogs. Over thousands of years, humans did far more than domesticate them. They continually shaped them. Every landscape presented a different challenge. Every challenge became a new selective pressure. Over time, those pressures produced breeds whose appearance, behavior, and abilities became almost completely different from one another. When we look at working dogs, We are not simply looking at the history of dogs. We are looking at a map of the hardships humanity once faced. Wherever lions existed, one kind of dog emerged. Wherever avalanches threatened human lives, another kind appeared. Wherever livestock needed protection from wolves, yet another evolutionary path unfolded. In southern Africa, the greatest danger did not come from cold or starvation. It had a golden mane, powerful claws, and the strength to bring down some of the largest animals on the grasslands. It was the lion. During the 18th and 19th centuries, across the lands that now include South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, farmers and big game hunters lived alongside one of the most formidable predators on Earth. Livestock could be attacked. Horses could be killed. Small settlements lived in a constant state of awareness. What people needed was not a dog strong enough to kill a lion. That was nearly impossible. What they needed was a dog capable of dealing with a lion. From that need, the Rhodesian Ridgeback gradually emerged. Its ancestors came from indigenous hunting dogs used by the Khoi people, combined with breeds brought by European settlers. Over generations of selective breeding, one remarkable feature remained and can still be seen today: a strip of hair growing in the opposite direction along the spine, creating the breed's unmistakable ridge. Yet appearance is not what made the Ridgeback famous. Its true distinction lies in its strategy. These dogs often worked as a team. They would approach, retreat, provoke, and evade. They forced the lion to focus on them, distracting the great predator and making it difficult to commit to an attack. The goal was never to defeat the lion. The goal was to keep it occupied long enough for humans to manage the situation. A dog that was too aggressive would rush into danger and die. A dog that was too fearful would flee when danger appeared. The Rhodesian Ridgeback survived because it struck a rare balance between courage, speed, and self-control. It was shaped by an environment where even the smallest mistake could be fatal. On the other side of the world, however, humanity faced an enemy with a very different form. It had no teeth, no claws. It fell from the sky as snowstorms. Beginning in the 17th century, the Great St. Bernard Pass in the Alps became one of the most important routes connecting regions of Europe. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims crossed winding mountain roads that cut through the high peaks. It was also a place where weather could change within hours. Fog swallowed the trails. Heavy snow buried landmarks. Sudden avalanches could erase every sign of human presence. In these conditions, monks at the Great St. Bernard Hospice began keeping large dogs to assist with the monastery's work. At first, the dogs served mainly as guards and guides. Over time, another ability became apparent. They could find people trapped in the snow. St. Bernards were never known for extraordinary speed, nor did they possess the specialized skills that modern rescue dogs often display. But their large bodies allowed them to withstand the cold. Their powerful legs carried them through deep snow. Most importantly, their sense of smell was sensitive enough to detect people buried beneath the frozen landscape. One fascinating detail is that young dogs often learned the work simply by watching older dogs. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next like a living tradition. Among these rescue dogs, one became legendary: Barry. Living in the early 19th century, Barry is credited with saving more than 40 people from death in the mountains. If the Rhodesian Ridgeback was shaped to face danger, the Saint Bernard was shaped to search for life after danger had already passed. Not every remarkable breed, however, emerged from the struggle for survival. As societies became more stable, some dogs began serving entirely different purposes: status, tradition, and entertainment. In Britain from the 17th through the 19th centuries, fox hunting became closely associated with the land-owning aristocracy. These hunts were not simply about finding food. They became social rituals that reflected wealth, power, and social standing. It was within this world that the English foxhound emerged. This breed was not designed to catch foxes as quickly as possible. Instead, it was selected for endurance. A hunt could continue across fields, forests, rolling hills, and dozens of kilometers of varied terrain. Breeders prioritized stamina over explosive speed. They selected dogs capable of working together as a pack, maintaining a steady pace, and following a scent trail for long periods of time. Here, dogs were no longer tools against starvation or dangerous predators. They became part of a culture. The presence of a foxhound pack reflected the social position of its owner just as much as the dog's hunting ability. Yet, in the remote mountains and grasslands of Eurasia, a far older conflict never truly ended. For thousands of years, herders across Turkey, the Caucasus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and much of Central Asia faced the constant challenge of protecting livestock from large predators. Grey wolves emerged under the cover of darkness. Brown bears sometimes wandered close to grazing areas. Lynxes watched for vulnerable young animals. The solution humans chose was not always to hunt the predators themselves. Sometimes the solution was simpler. Create dogs large enough and intimidating enough that attacks never happened in the first place. This is the world of the Kangal, the Caucasian Shepherd, and the Central Asian Shepherd. These breeds are completely different from the Border Collie. A Border Collie manages livestock through movement, speed, and direction. Livestock guardian dogs work through presence alone. Simply standing beside a flock is often enough to make a predator reconsider its approach. Over thousands of years, these dogs were selected to work independently, make their own decisions, observe from great distances, and respond quickly when danger appeared. They do not require constant commands from humans. In many situations, they assess threats on their own and act accordingly. It is a different kind of intelligence, an intelligence shaped by long nights in mountain valleys and across vast open grasslands. Looking back at all these breeds, a pattern gradually becomes clear. The Rhodesian Ridgeback exists because of lions. The Saint Bernard exists because of avalanches. The foxhound exists because of hunting culture. The Kangal exists because of wolves. Each breed represents a solution to a different problem humans encountered throughout history. They shared distant ancestry in the wolves of the Ice Age, yet they followed entirely different paths of development. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing about dogs is not their size or appearance. It is their astonishing ability to adapt. Through generations of selective breeding, dogs became almost anything humans needed them to be. Guardians, rescuers, pursuers, protectors. A form of living biotechnology created not in laboratories, but through thousands of years of shared history between two species. Yet as time passed, dogs no longer lived only on grasslands. They no longer appeared solely on battlefields, in hunting parties, or beside livestock. They began to enter another realm, a place that belonged neither to geography nor biology, a place within human imagination, ancient stories, sacred rituals, gods who stood watch over the boundary between life and death, and the worlds beyond, where many believed the journey continued after life on Earth had come to an end. What makes the same animal become, at once, a guide for souls, a guardian of the underworld, a symbol of death, and a symbol of loyalty? It is a question that appears again and again throughout human history. The wider we look across different civilizations, the stranger this coincidence becomes. From the cities along the Mediterranean coast to the deserts stretching beside the Nile, from the frozen landscapes of the far north to the ancient civilizations of Central America, in countless places that remained disconnected for most of history, people created a remarkably familiar image: a dog standing beside the doorway to the next world, waiting at the boundary between what is known and what no one can ever truly know. Tens of thousands of years spent alongside humans created a bond that very few other animals have ever shared. Dogs were present during the earliest hunts. They slept beside ancient campfires. They traveled with people through unfamiliar lands, harsh winters, and migrations that lasted for generations. Their constant presence made them the most familiar animal in everyday life. Perhaps because they were so familiar, humans began assigning them roles that extended far beyond the physical world. When people tried to imagine what might await them after death, many communities did not choose strange or exotic creatures. They chose the animal that had walked beside them the longest. Dogs became guides, guardians, and protectors for humanity's final journey. Among all these figures, the most famous is perhaps Cerberus, the guardian of the underworld in ancient Greek mythology. The Greeks imagined the realm of the dead as a place existing beyond ordinary life. Rivers marked its boundaries, gates opened into darkness. An unbreakable law governed everything there. The dead belonged among the dead. The living were not meant to cross that line. Standing watch at that gate was Cerberus, most often described as a three-headed dog with a serpent's tail and features drawn from monsters. Its appearance alone conveyed the sense of something impossible to overcome. What makes this especially interesting is that the Greeks had many other choices. They could have placed a dragon before the gates of the underworld. They could have chosen a sea monster or some unimaginable beast. Instead, they chose a dog. The reason may be surprisingly simple. In everyday life, dogs were guardians. They protected homes, livestock, and people. When imagination expanded to a cosmic scale, that role expanded with it. Cerberus was not the embodiment of evil. Its purpose was to maintain order. It prevented the dead from returning to the world of the living and stopped the living from entering the realm of the dead. It stood between two worlds like a sentinel that never abandoned its post. Even so, many heroes attempted to pass it. Some used music to calm the beast's vigilance. Others relied on patience and cunning. Some confronted it through sheer strength. These encounters helped turn Cerberus into one of history's most enduring symbols of the boundary between life and death. Yet on the other side of the Atlantic, another civilization viewed dogs from an almost opposite perspective. In the Aztec world, Xolotl appeared as a deity with the form of a dog or the head of a dog. Unlike Cerberus, who blocked a gate, Xolotl walked beside souls on their journey. The Aztecs believed that after death, the soul had to travel a long and difficult path before reaching the land of the dead. It was not a simple passage. The journey was filled with obstacles that no soul could overcome alone. That was where Xolotl entered the story, serving as a guide. This belief deeply influenced burial traditions. Many communities buried dogs alongside the deceased because they believed those loyal companions would continue their service after life had ended. In this view, dogs were not guardians of death. They were companions through death. If Cerberus represented a door closing behind you, Xolotl represented a road that continued onward. Far to the east, along the ancient Nile, another figure emerged with equal importance. Anubis was one of the oldest gods associated with the world of the dead. He was usually depicted with the head of a jackal or dog upon a human body. This image appeared very early in Egyptian history and became closely tied to the most important rituals surrounding death. Anubis was not a god of destruction. He was a protector. He guarded tombs, oversaw the process of mummification, and guided souls into their next state of existence. The origins of this image may lie in the natural world itself. Jackals were often seen around cemeteries located at the edges of the desert. To many communities, this was an unsettling sight. Yet instead of allowing that fear to remain a threat, the Egyptians transformed it into a symbol of protection. A creature that once caused anxiety around graves gradually became the guardian of those graves. A fear became a god. In Egypt, dogs were not simply companions in daily life. They became figures standing between the two greatest states of human existence, life and death. But in Northern Europe, where winters were long and nature often seemed far less forgiving, the image of the dog took on a different tone. Gamor was described as a giant blood-stained dog or wolf guarding the gates of Helheim. Like Cerberus, it stood at the border between the living and the dead. Yet Gamor carried a deeper meaning tied to a greater fear. In Norse imagination, the world was not destined to last forever. One day, Ragnarok would come. It would be the moment when every established order collapsed. Gods would wage war. Bound forces would be released. Nature itself would rise against the structures that had once contained it. On that day, Gamor would break free from its chains and enter the final battle. Its confrontation with the god Tyr would end in the death of both. The image reflects an ancient fear, the fear that every form of order may eventually fall apart. If Anubis represented an orderly transition between states of existence, Gamor represented the moment of chaos when the world itself stood on the edge of ending. Not every culture, however, linked dogs directly to death. Across many East Asian traditions, they carried a gentler but equally meaningful role. At temples, palaces, tombs, and ancient gates, one often finds statues of dogs or guardian creatures bearing canine features. They do not hunt. They do not rescue. They do not fight wars. Their purpose is symbolic and spiritual. These stone guardians stand where inside meets outside. They protect sacred spaces, drive away harmful influences, and preserve an invisible balance. Although the forms vary, one idea appears again and again across civilizations. Dogs stand at boundaries, between inside and outside, between safety and danger, between the familiar and the unknown. between life and death. That may be why dogs appear throughout humanity's symbolic world. Tigers do not appear in every civilization. Bears do not either. Many powerful animals are tied only to particular regions. Dogs alone appear across Greece, Egypt, Northern Europe, Central America, and East Asia. For tens of thousands of years, they have stood beside humans during life's most important moments, during hunts, during migrations, during battles, during long nights of watchfulness, during the painful farewell to loved ones. Perhaps when an animal accompanies humanity for long enough, it no longer lives only in the homes people build. It begins to live within collective memory, within fear, within hope, and within the deepest questions humans have ever asked about their own existence. But if mythology reveals how people imagined dogs, the modern world reveals something equally remarkable. Among the hundreds of dog breeds alive today are some whose appearance and traits seem as though they have stepped directly out of an ancient legend. Sometimes reality reaches far beyond imagination, and the strangest creatures are not found in myths at all. They are living right beside us. After tens of thousands of years alongside humans, just how much has the dog changed? The answer sometimes stretches far beyond ordinary imagination. In today's canine world, there are dogs that barely bark at all. Some breeds produce sounds that resemble songs more than howls. Others have almost no fur on their bodies. There are even dogs with 6 fully developed toes on each foot. If someone from a few thousand years ago were suddenly transported into the present and saw all of them standing side by side, they would probably assume they were looking at entirely different species. It is difficult to believe that every one of them belongs to the same species that originated from ancient Ice Age wolf populations. In nature, most animals are shaped by the environments they inhabit. A species that lives in forests adapts to forests. A species that lives in the mountains adapts to mountains. Dogs, however, followed a very different path. Their greatest habitat was not a forest, a desert, or a grassland. Their habitat was humanity itself. As people spread across the planet, dogs traveled with them. They entered the humid rainforests of Central Africa. They climbed into the mist-covered mountains of New Guinea. They survived in the arid landscapes of ancient Mexico. They adapted to the cold islands off the coast of Norway. Every place demanded something different. Every culture needed a different set of skills. Over thousands of years, these evolutionary paths produced forms so unusual that even biologists sometimes find them astonishing. One of the most famous examples begins with something that seems surprisingly simple: silence. In the Congo basin of Central Africa, long before many modern European breeds existed, a remarkable dog lived alongside local hunting communities. That dog was the Basenji. Throughout most of human civilization, barking has been almost synonymous with being a dog. People expect dogs to sound alarms with loud, far-carrying barks. Yet the Basenji can barely produce that kind of sound. The reason lies in the structure of its larynx and vocal cords, which differ slightly from those of most other dogs. Instead of barking, Basenjis produce a distinctive yodeling sound, often described as a short song with constantly shifting notes. It is part howl, part melody, creating something very different from what most people associate with a dog. This trait is not simply an oddity. In the dense forests of Central Africa, where prey animals quickly react to unfamiliar sounds, silence can be a major advantage. Basenjis were used to locate small animals, drive game toward nets, and work within thick forest environments. Sometimes, a quiet dog is far more effective than a noisy one. What makes the Basenji even more remarkable is how many ancient traits it has retained. It has very little body odor and often cleans itself by licking its coat, much like a cat. Its breeding cycle usually occurs only once each year, a pattern closer to wolves than to most modern dogs. Each characteristic feels like a surviving trace from the earliest chapters of canine evolution. But if the Basenji almost never barks, there is another dog on the opposite side of the world that seems to have chosen to sing. High in the mountains of New Guinea, where clouds cling to the landscape year-round, and many regions remained isolated from the outside world for centuries, lives one of the most mysterious dog populations ever discovered, the New Guinea singing dog. For decades, these animals were known primarily through captive populations. Many feared that their wild relatives had vanished entirely. Later surveys in the highlands of Papua, however, uncovered wild dogs with an extraordinarily close genetic relationship to them. What makes this breed famous is not its appearance. Its greatest distinction lies in its voice. Its call can change pitch continuously during a single vocalization. The sound rises and falls like a brief melody, far more complex than the familiar howl of most dogs. When several individuals vocalize together, the result is a strange chorus of overlapping tones echoing through the mountains. Thousands of years of isolation helped preserve many ancient traits. Looking at a New Guinea singing dog can feel like looking at a living fragment of canine prehistory. If the Basenji and the singing dog amaze us through sound, the next breed captures attention the moment it comes into view. In southern China, the Shar-Pei has existed for centuries with an appearance unlike any other. Shar-Pei puppies seem as though they are wearing skin several sizes too large. Deep folds cover the head, neck, and body, creating one of the most distinctive looks found among mammals. Behind those wrinkles lies an unusual biological mechanism. Their bodies produce large amounts of a compound that accumulates within tissues beneath the skin, creating the thick layers and folds that define the breed. A relatively small genetic change produced an appearance so unique that it is difficult to find anything similar in other dogs. Yet the history of the Shar-Pei is not simply a story about wrinkles. For generations, these dogs worked as guards, protected property, and assisted with hunting. Their famous folds are only the most visible part of a long working heritage. If the Shar-Pei seems to have too much skin, the next breed appears to have almost no fur at all. In ancient Mexico, long before Europeans arrived in the Americas, the Xoloitzcuintli had already become a familiar part of life among many indigenous communities. Its name combines that of a deity associated with the afterlife and the Nahuatl word for dog. The name itself reflects the breed's unique place within local culture. Most Xoloitzcuintlis are nearly hairless. Their dark skin is fully exposed, making them look completely different from long-coated breeds. This difference stems from a dominant genetic mutation. A small change in genetic material was enough to create a form that appears almost entirely new. For centuries, these dogs were more than companions. They appeared in burial traditions, artistic works, and beliefs surrounding the soul's journey after death. Their unusual appearance became intertwined with a cultural role that endured across generations. But if the Zoloid squintly astonishes through its skin, the final breed draws attention because of its skeleton. Off the northern coast of Norway, the Lofoten Islands rise from the cold sea. For centuries, local communities depended heavily on puffins. The birds and their eggs provided an important source of food. The challenge was that puffins nested on cliffs that were nearly vertical. To solve that problem, a very unusual dog emerged, the Norwegian Lundehund. This breed possesses features so rare that they seem almost unbelievable. Each foot has 6 fully developed toes. Its shoulders are extraordinarily flexible. Its neck can bend backward to an unusual degree. Its ears can fold shut to keep out dirt and water. None of these traits appeared by accident. Every one of them served a specific purpose. Together, they allowed the Lundehund to climb dangerous cliffs, squeeze into narrow crevices, and reach puffin nests located in places that humans could hardly access themselves. The result was one of the strangest dog breeds on Earth. Not designed to hunt large game, not built to pull sleds or defend territory. It evolved to solve a very specific challenge on a handful of isolated islands in the North Atlantic. When we look at the Basenji, the New Guinea singing dog, the Sharpei, the Zoloid squintly, or the Norwegian Lundehund, we begin to recognize something important. The dog is not a finished design that appeared once and remained unchanged forever. It is more like an experiment that has been running for tens of thousands of years. Every landscape left its mark. Every culture contributed a new direction. Every human need created a different version of the same animal. Perhaps the strangest thing about dogs is not what they have become. What is even more remarkable is that the process may not be over. If dogs have changed this dramatically in the past, another question naturally emerges. Has that evolutionary journey truly reached its end? Or, at this very moment, while they lie quietly beside us in modern homes, are dogs still changing in ways we have not yet noticed? When you look at a dog sleeping peacefully on a sofa, it is easy to feel as though its journey has already reached its destination. The wolf ancestors faded into the distant past tens of thousands of years ago. Domestication happened. Hundreds of breeds emerged, from sled dogs crossing Arctic landscapes to tiny companion dogs living in modern apartments. It can seem as though every possible path has already been explored. But biology does not work that way. Evolution has no finish line. There is no moment when a species can declare that it has completed its transformation. Evolution is simply life responding to the world around it. When the environment changes, the direction of evolution changes with it. For most of canine history, the forces shaping dogs came from long winters, endless hunts, migrating reindeer crossing cold grasslands, competition with wolves and bears, and countless other challenges of survival. Human needs also helped shape each generation. Individuals that hunted better, stayed more alert, or endured hardship more effectively often had a greater chance of surviving. Today, many of those ancient pressures are fading in large parts of the world. Few dogs ever encounter a bear. Few need to run for dozens of kilometers in pursuit of prey. Yet that does not mean evolution has stopped. New pressures are quietly emerging. They may seem less dramatic than a prehistoric hunt, but in some ways, they can be just as powerful. One of the newest evolutionary environments on Earth is not a forest or a desert. It is the city. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, vast urban centers spread across North America, Europe, and Asia. Millions of dogs became residents of an ecosystem that had never existed during most of their evolutionary history. This is a world of elevators, apartment hallways, public parks, traffic noise, and endless streams of people. For thousands of years, dogs existed primarily to work. They pulled sleds, hunted game, herded livestock, or guarded animals. Today, many dogs no longer perform any of those traditional roles. Their most important task is simply to live alongside humans. This seemingly small shift is creating entirely new selective pressures. In urban environments, individuals that can tolerate constant noise often experience less stress. Dogs that comfortably accept strangers, adapt to limited living spaces, and synchronize with human routines are more likely to thrive under human care. Over many generations, those behavioral traits may continue to accumulate. Some scientists suggest that the ability to read human emotions, communicate through eye contact, and regulate stress responses may be becoming more important than many of the skills that once helped their ancestors survive in the wild. In other words, understanding humans may, in many cases, matter more than hunting. Yet not every dog on Earth lives in a modern apartment. Across parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America, a different evolutionary pathway continues to unfold right before our eyes. It is the world of village dogs and free-ranging dog populations. These dogs live near human communities but are not completely dependent on them. They do not belong to any specific purebred lineage. They find their own food, choose their own mates, and face environmental challenges on their own. In fact, more dogs around the world belong to these populations than to the famous purebred breeds commonly seen in shows, advertisements, and popular culture. What makes these populations so fascinating is that they allow us to observe natural selection almost in real time. No breeder decides which individuals reproduce. No appearance standard is imposed. The environment makes the final decision. Food makes the decision. Disease makes the decision. Climate makes the decision. Individuals that adapt more successfully continue to survive. Those less suited to their surroundings gradually disappear from the population. For many geneticists, modern village dog populations are like a doorway into the past. They provide the closest living glimpse of the earliest stages of domestication, when the ancestors of dogs were still learning how to live beside humans and had not yet been heavily shaped by deliberate breeding. But the future of dogs will not be determined only by cities or village streets. The entire planet is changing as well. Average global temperatures are rising, climate zones are shifting. Parasites and disease-carrying organisms are expanding into regions where they could not survive before. These changes affect humans, but they also affect dogs. Consider breeds developed for extremely cold environments, such as the Siberian Husky, the Alaskan Malamute, or the Greenland dog. They possess dense coats, efficient heat retention, and exceptionally high energy levels. Those traits were tremendous advantages in frozen landscapes. But as average temperatures rise, old advantages may gradually become challenges. Heat tolerance, adaptation to urban environments, and resistance to emerging diseases may become increasingly important traits in the future. Climate has always been one of the most powerful drivers of evolution on Earth. What makes the present era unusual is the speed at which change is occurring. For most generations of dogs throughout history, environmental conditions shifted far more slowly than they do today. Yet the greatest change may not come from the environment at all. It may come from humans. For tens of thousands of years, humans altered dogs through selection. We decided which individuals would reproduce. We chose which traits would remain. Then we waited through generation after generation as those changes slowly appeared. The 21st century has introduced an entirely new possibility: direct intervention in the genome itself. Through advances in genetic sequencing, scientists are gaining a deeper understanding of the DNA regions associated with disease, behavior, and biological traits in dogs. Much of today's research focuses on reducing inherited disorders, identifying harmful genes, improving population health, and preserving genetic diversity. Yet behind these achievements lies a deeper question. If one day humans can completely eliminate inherited diseases from a breed, is that still evolution? If we can intentionally create new traits through genetic technology, is that still the result of natural selection? Or have we entered something entirely different? For the first time in history, the first animal to step into human history may also become the first animal whose genetic future humans can consciously rewrite. That realization leads to a broader conclusion. Dogs have never stopped changing. Only the forces driving those changes have changed. There was a time when the force was the Ice Age. Then came the first human campfires, then agriculture, kingdoms, empires, modern cities, and now technology. Each era leaves its mark on the canine genome. Much like layers of rock preserve the history of the Earth, no chapter ever truly closes. New chapters simply emerge from the foundations of the old ones. Perhaps evolution was never a story about becoming a final, perfect version of something. Perhaps it has always been a story about adaptation, the ability to change when the world changes, the ability to survive within a reality that never stands still. And when we look back across that entire journey, from the wolves standing quietly beyond the glow of prehistoric campfires, to the dogs resting beside us today, one final question begins to emerge. What is it that makes the story of dogs more extraordinary than the story of any other animal? What is it that made them the only creatures to willingly step into the history of humankind? Among the millions of species that have appeared on Earth, only a small number have lived alongside humans. Fewer still became true partners. Yet when we look back across the entire history of life, it is difficult to find a relationship that reshaped the destiny of both sides as profoundly as the one between humans and dogs. After a journey stretching from the frozen grasslands of the late Ice Age to the modern cities of today, from ancient wolves to the hundreds of dog breeds that now exist across the world, one quiet question remains. What makes this story different? What transformed dogs from a domesticated animal into a living part of human history itself? To answer that question, we must return to a time when dogs did not yet exist. Between roughly 15 and 30,000 years ago, the cold steppes of Eurasia and Northern Asia were home to ancient wolf populations and some of the first hunter-gatherer communities. No names were recorded, no witnesses remained. There was no official moment marking the beginning of domestication. Perhaps it began with something very small. A few wolves were less afraid of humans than the others. A few human groups were more tolerant of their presence. Around hunting camps, discarded food created a reliable source of resources. The boldest wolves began appearing a little closer than before. In return, they gained a better chance of surviving the harsh winters. What they offered back was something humans couldn't yet fully recognize. Their sharp hearing detected danger from a distance. Their powerful sense of smell revealed signs that humans could not perceive. Their warning barks became the first line of defense around a camp. A quiet cycle of cooperation began to take shape. None of the people living on those frozen plains knew they were witnessing the beginning of a relationship that would endure for tens of thousands of years. No one could have known that the small changes unfolding before them would eventually create an entirely new branch on the evolutionary tree. Generation after generation passed. The distance between the two species gradually narrowed. A new kind of creature began to emerge. It was no longer completely wolf, yet it was not quite the familiar dog we know today. A new evolutionary path had opened. From a biological perspective, it was an extraordinary transformation. From an evolutionary perspective, however, the most fascinating part is how it happened. Looking back, it is easy to imagine that wolves evolved in order to become dogs. The reality is very different. Evolution has no destination. There was never a hidden blueprint stating that wolves were meant to become dogs. No future had been planned in advance. Ancient wolves were not trying to become anything other than themselves. They were simply responding to a new environment. And within that environment, the presence of humans created opportunities for the individuals best suited to take advantage of them. The less aggressive wolves held an advantage. Those capable of living near people gained more reliable access to food. They survived more often, reproduced more successfully, and passed more of their genes to future generations. Across hundreds and then thousands of generations, those small changes accumulated. Aggression gradually declined. The ability to communicate with humans increased. Social behaviors shifted. Physical appearance began to change as well. The result was one of the most dramatic transformations ever seen among mammals. From a wild Ice Age predator, emerged hundreds of dog breeds so different in size, shape, and function that it can sometimes seem impossible to believe they all belong to the same species. Yet the story of dogs reveals more than the mechanics of evolution. It reveals something about ourselves. For most of human history, many animals were controlled through fences, ropes, cages, or force. The relationship between humans and dogs followed a different path. Humans gained help with hunting, early warnings of danger, and protection for their homes. Dogs gained food, shelter, and a level of security rarely available in the wild. Both sides benefited. Over time, the relationship grew deeper than a simple exchange of advantages could explain. Dogs learned to read the human gaze. They became capable of understanding pointing gestures, facial expressions, and subtle social signals. In return, humans learned to interpret the posture, sounds, and behavior of dogs. Two very different species began building a communication system of their own. The history of dogs is therefore not merely the history of domestication. It is the history of cooperation, one of the most successful examples of interspecies collaboration ever seen in nature. That cooperation unlocked the most remarkable ability of all, the ability to keep changing. Place a sled dog from Greenland beside a livestock guardian from the Caucasus, a Basenji from the forests of Central Africa, and a Chihuahua living in a modern apartment. The differences between them are so extreme that it is hard to believe they belong to the same species, from the frozen Arctic to the driest deserts, from open grasslands to tropical forests, from high mountain ranges to densely populated megacities. Dogs have followed humans into nearly every environment we have ever inhabited. The secret behind that success is not unmatched speed, not unmatched strength, not unmatched size. It is adaptation. Throughout the history of life, the species that endure are rarely the most dominant. They are the most flexible, the ones capable of changing when the world changes, the ones capable of finding a new path when the old one disappears. Dogs are one of the clearest examples of that principle. And when we step back and look at the entire journey, from the ancient wolves wandering the frozen tundra of the late Ice Age to the dogs sleeping beside humans today, a final thought begins to emerge. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is not that wolves became dogs. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is that two completely different species created a shared history together. One was a bipedal primate, endlessly curious and constantly trying to reshape the world around it. The other was a canine predator, shaped by adaptation and cooperation. Over the course of that journey, both changed. Dogs changed because of humans. Humans changed because of dogs. Together they endured the final winters of the Ice Age. Together they took part in the earliest hunts. Together they entered the agricultural age. Together they witnessed the rise of civilizations. Together they appeared in wars, expeditions, modern cities, and the everyday lives of millions of families. Not as master and tool, but as two species adapting alongside one another. Perhaps the greatest changes in history do not begin with power. They do not begin with conquest. They do not begin with war. They begin the moment two unfamiliar creatures discover that they can coexist. And sometimes, the history of an entire world changes simply because one of them took a single step closer.